Hello, I'm Professor McCoy, and today I want to talk a little more about the Star Wars Expanded Universe. In fact, I want to talk a little more about the fall of Jacen Solo to become Darth Caedus. I've talked about this topic a little bit before in the first video in this series, but I only really talked about it in the context of how I think we should feel about Star Wars sort of from the outside, from our external perspective. What I didn't really do is I didn't go into, I think, enough detail, at least not for its own video, into how and why Jacen, this incredibly heroic character with this long storied lineage, wound up falling to the dark side. Now, lots of people will point to certain parallels and certain things that happened to him, certain events. I'm going to breeze through most of that. But I do want to talk about a few things that we can actually take from Jacen's experiences into our own that I think are genuine spiritual dangers that we non-Force users might encounter. So if that sounds interesting, stay tuned. That said, I don't think I can avoid spoilers when talking about this sort of topic. That is, of course, to say, if the Jacen Solo falls to the dark side and becomes Darth Caedus is not a spoiler enough already. To be fair, this is a 20-something-year-old series of books, but still, if you want to avoid spoilers for the Legacy of the Force series especially, but even to some extent for the Yuuzhan Vong invasion in the new Jedi Order series, as well as little bits and pieces from the Dark Nest trilogy, if you want to avoid spoilers for any of those until you've already read them, now's your time. Go away, and then come back once you've done. Once you're done reading them, absolutely come back, because like I said, I think that we can actually draw something from this for our own spiritual lives in the real world. So, now that you've left and come back, and now that those of you who have already read it or don't really care about spoilers are staying, let's dive into it. My thesis here is that Jacen fell for three primary reasons, and those reasons are spiritual errors that you and I can fall into just as easily as a Jedi. Now, like I said, a lot of people will point to his torture at the hands of Rhaegyra and the Yuuzhan Vong. A lot of people will point to the parallels to his grandfather, Darth Vader, or Anakin Skywalker, depending on what stage of the fall we're talking about. A lot of people will talk about his relationship with Tenel Ka and his dedication to his daughter, Alana. All of these are important factors, but by themselves don't account for why he ultimately fell and why he ultimately became Darth Caedus. To actually explain that, we have to look more into what we might call Jacen's spiritual psychology, how he experiences the mysticism of the Force. And his three problems are roughly in order, both of importance, in sort of ascending order of importance, but then as well in chronological order, because he really does experience these, go through these problems one by one, and they build on each other. The first one I sort of have to provide a name for us, because for all the examples of this I can point to, there isn't a sort of agreed upon name for the phenomenon, and that is a kind of mystical nostalgia. At least that's what I'm going to be calling it. This is the phenomenon where one has a profound mystical experience at some point in one's life, and then goes on to obsess over recapturing, re-experiencing, or maybe even surpassing that profound mystical experience. And of course, the problem with this is that mystical experiences are not something to be sought after, they're something to be received. And that is certainly the case for Jacen Solo. So Jacen, at the end of the Yuuzhan Vong War, briefly became one with the Force. He experienced complete oneness with all life in the cosmos. In his final confrontation with the Supreme Overlord of the Yuuzhan Vong, he saved the galaxy, he saved himself, he saved Luke Skywalker, he saved everyone. And in the process, like I said, became one with the Force. He experienced this absolutely profound mystical vision, which was itself fulfillment of a prophecy, of a dream he had been having throughout the war. And so it's hard to undersell or hard to underestimate the importance of this for his own sort of mystical psychology, the his spiritual development as a Jedi. And after this, we see Jacen obsess over prophecy, over becoming one with the Force, over understanding the Force, over his own further mystical experiences. And he struggles with a kind of Jedi version of having peaked in high school, if you want to think of it that way. But I think that is a maybe shallow way of looking at it, because I don't want to just say, well, yeah, sure, he saved the world and he saved the galaxy when he was 18, 19 years old, something like that. And then went on to, live an uneventful life, to retire at 20, or to go on a mystical journey, a walkabout about the galaxy, and to discover more about the Force, and to try desperately to top the experience that he had once had. That's what he chooses, right? Immediately after the Yuuzhan Vong War concludes, there's a 5-year gap in the novels during which Jacen wanders the galaxy, finding out all he can from as many orders of Force users, non-Jedi groups, that he can possibly find for 5 whole years, and he comes back a changed man. A somewhat darker man. Not fully fallen yet, of course, but certainly on the path. Now, I want to hold off a little bit, because I'll talk about that more specifically, because I think that ties in with the second major problem. But to finish addressing this sort of mystical nostalgia problem, we can relate that to our own spiritual lives as well. If we have a sort of profound mystical experience, an experience of the divine, an experience of revelation of ourselves, of a vision, of anything like this, any kind of mystical experience we might have, the temptation is always to grab onto it and to want to keep that experience with us. And once it evanesces, which is the nature of such things, there's a temptation, at least, to want to try and pursue the same thing over again, to try and re-experience it. I'm recording this during Lent, and one of the most prominent and important gospel readings that we always read during Lent is some version of the transfiguration of Christ. When the disciples go with Jesus to the top of the mountain, and he is transfigured into this brilliant all white, and he meets with Moses and Elijah, and, well, what does Peter do when experiencing this profound mystical vision of his teacher, of God himself, and of these ancient prophets? He offers to pitch a tent for them, to provide for them a home, a tabernacle, to stay with them, with the apostles. But that isn't right. That isn't what needs to be done. Instead, he needs to experience this moment, to learn from it, and to move forward. And that can be difficult, but that is ultimately what Peter does, and what the apostles do, and what we ought to do with these kinds of profound mystical experiences. If they are of any real significance at all, they're significant for moving forward, moving through life. An experience like this is not meant to be dwelled upon. It's meant to be learned from, and it's meant to propel us forward through life, to have us continue to do better and more wonderful things, not to simply have a mystical experience for its own sake. And that's a temptation I think we can fall into. We can sort of, again, perhaps like Jacen, we can sort of spiritually peak in high school if we have these kinds of mystical experiences, but only ever want to recapture them. Well, then what? Then what are we doing? We're only ever pining back for something that we will never ultimately recapture, certainly not of our own accord. So Jacen, moving forward through his life in this sort of attempt to recapture this profound mystical vision that he had, he runs headlong into what is the second problem that I will point to, which is syncretism. Syncretism, in our context, in a philosophical context, or perhaps a religious context, is the attempt to construct for one's own self a whole tradition from bits and pieces that one gathers from many different cohesive traditions, rather than taking things as they stand, as part of some comprehensive whole, and understanding them within that context. We are sometimes tempted to pick and to choose as if from a buffet, right? This is the cafeteria model of religion, or of sort of developing our own religious experience. What Jacen does is, as I said, travels the galaxy on his own for 5 years. And on his own here is very important. He doesn't go with a master. He is only a Jedi Knight at this point. He only ever becomes a Jedi Knight, really. He doesn't seek advice from anyone within his own tradition, anyone wise that he has already learned to look up to and to learn from. No, he goes on his own. He sets out by himself, of his own initiative, and leaning on his own understanding entirely. To go and to learn. Now, learning is not bad. Learning is certainly a good thing. But the way that he approaches this is an attempt to see what he can learn from all of these other Force traditions and integrate into his own Jedi system. Rather than taking, or I should maybe say, rather than accepting that which is put forward as a holistic system, whether that's the Jedi system or any other that he winds up encountering, he decides to construct something of his own. And in so doing, he places himself above all of these other teachers that he is ostensibly learning from, even his own teachers as a Jedi, because he is organizing this new system, this new tradition. He knows better than any given tradition, because he only takes parts and pieces of these various traditions, the Jedi included. And so what he's doing is he's setting himself up as the judge of what is worth taking and what is worth leaving for all of these various traditions within the Force. And he goes, again, all across the galaxy. He visits the Dathomiri, the witches of Dathomir. He visits the Falinasi. He visits the Barando sages on Keldor, or Doran, the Keldor people, the picture. He visits the Ang-Ti monks. All these sorts of various orders of Force users he visits, and he learns little bits and pieces from, but not enough to really try and understand them holistically. Now, spiritually, we have this problem all the time. We can do this. There's always a temptation when you are wanting to explore and to try and figure out what the world is really like, to listen to a plethora of different perspectives and try and judge for one's own what each of them gets right. Now, there's an element of use to that. There's an element of utility to listening to the wisdom of various traditions. But to try and pick bits and pieces of all of the different ones and judge for oneself what new set of ideas that I'm going to construct of my own wisdom is pure hubris. That is only pride speaking and nothing else. That is assuming that one is wiser and more intelligent than not only all of the people one has learned from, but everyone in each and every one of those traditions, including one's own. If you're sort of cobbling things together on top of a basic set, so to speak. If say a Catholic is to go to all of the various other Christian denominations and choose bits and pieces to sort of integrate into their own spiritual practices, perhaps, but be careful. Be careful, one, that you're not doing something untoward. You're not adapting something which ought not to be adapted, but beyond that, make sure that you're not becoming your own pope, so to speak. Another example of this sort of thing in a less spiritual realm, but still perhaps slightly, is the phenomenon of mixed martial arts. I've always, as having grown up as a traditional martial artist, I studied Mitsung Kung Fu primarily. The idea of mixed martial arts to me has always seemed extremely crude. It does exactly this sort of thing that I'm thinking of and that I'm talking about. It is picking and choosing little bits and pieces from an array of different martial traditions and trying to decide for oneself what their effectiveness is within a new system that we are creating and calling MMA, right? Now, this ignores the holism of any given tradition, and it ignores the wisdom of integrating one piece with all of the other pieces that it evolved alongside. It's, to use another analogy, it's more like a zoo than it is like a natural biome. And while zoos might have their utility and they might have their beauty, they are not in any way the same thing, or not even a close approximation of a natural biome, of an environment. So finally, after having returned from his great walkabout, his great journey, and after having had his daughter, and after having resolved a few more crises in the galaxy, Jacen well and truly begins his descent to the dark side, and this is recounted in the Legacy of the Force series. And is at this point, begins a little bit in the Dark Nest trilogy a few years earlier, but it really comes to a head here, where Jacen encounters his third massive spiritual hurdle, which is fatalism. Jacen begins putting more and more stock into visions of the future, into predictions, into destinies and fate. What I am meant to do, rather than what I am to do. As I talked about before, in the other video, again, linked below, it's the beginning of this playlist, Lumaya, the Dark Lady of the Sith, who ultimately tempts him to the dark side, is able to do so by presenting him with a prophecy that she either found somewhere, and maybe a genuine prophecy of the Sith, or perhaps even just invented from whole cloth. Cloth, because it's tassels. It's depicted in tassel form. Sorry. In any case, though, Jacen is reeled in by this. He's pulled in hook, line, and sinker by this prophecy describing him as the destined Sith, who's to bring order to the galaxy and to bring to maintain a safe galaxy for the people of the future generations, including his own daughter. And so, what does he decide to do about this? Well, he decides to fulfill the prophecy, to rather than simply accepting that he is destined for this end or what have you. Rather, he chooses to act in a way that fulfills what he sees as the conditions of the prophecy. He's steering into the destiny that he sees for himself. This is very different from just thinking that we are determined, because he doesn't think that. He thinks that we are determined, but that means that this is the path forward that I ought to take. He's deriving a sort of normative claim from prophecy, from fate. And this tragically limits his options in a few key points. One, the one I already mentioned and I already talked about in the previous video, was his murder of his aunt, Mara Jade Skywalker. He did this purely to try to fulfill this prophecy about himself. He would have had no other reason to do so. Perhaps she suspected him and he needed to eliminate her as a potential witness or what have you, but so much of what led to it was because he was fulfilling this prophecy, and he needed to. He felt that he needed to. He assumed that he would only apotheosize as a Sith and become the Dark Lord of the Sith once he had fulfilled this prophecy. And so it led to his aunt's murder. But there's a couple of other examples that I want to point to. One near the very beginning of his sort of career as a Sith, when he first made the decision to fall to the dark side, and then finally one right near the end, which ultimately led to his downfall. Not his fall to the dark side, but his death. Both, funny enough, directly involving Luke Skywalker, his uncle. The first of these was when Lumaya initially lures him down into these ancient mines, infused with the dark side, to try to tempt him to accept the use of the dark side and accept his destiny as a Sith. He goes along with two other people, his apprentice Ben Skywalker and an old friend of his from the Academy. Now, this old friend looked up to him to a great degree, and they were associates, not really close friends, but they had a mutual respect. Certainly, he had a respect for her, and he wasn't going to bring her to any harm. But of course, because this story is a tragedy, he winds up killing her. And this really sets off his fall to the dark side. But the reason he has for this is because, first of all, she is there when he makes his choice to become a Sith. And being a Jedi, she does not want to have anything to do with this. And in fact, she would do anything she possibly could to stop it. He can't have that. But that's more like a psychologizing reason. The reason he presents as to why he had to kill her is that he looks into the future. He seeks prophecy, he seeks fate, and he sees that in every possible future that he can see, where he allows her to live, he ultimately will come into conflict with Luke Skywalker and will ultimately wind up striking him down. And so, the way Jacen sees it, in this case, is that the only way to prevent the death of Luke Skywalker at his own hands, of course, is to kill his friend here, now. And if he doesn't do that, there's no way possible, there's no possible future in which Jacen will not strike down Luke Skywalker. And so, to save Luke's life, whose life is far more important to the galaxy, he has to make this sacrifice now. But there are a plethora of problems with this. Again, all deriving from this seeking to fulfill one's fate more than anything else. And I mean, the obvious problems are, if you know the rest of the story, he later directly attempts to kill Luke Skywalker several times. Once he has fallen fully to the dark side, he has become a Sith and accepted that as his role and accepted the Jedi, therefore, as his enemies. He tries to kill Luke several times, all unsuccessfully, dramatically unsuccessfully. And so his motivations here change radically, or at least his stated motivations change radically. But that's what happens when you give in to temptation more and more and more. You fall further and further into madness, into evil. But then further, perhaps the greater problem, if not the more obvious one, is that when he looks into the future, what he sees are a series of choices made by him and made by others. And ultimately, what he is afraid of and what he is attempting to avoid, or at least what he says he's attempting to avoid, is his own action. Jacen is trying to avoid Jacen killing Luke. Now, if you know anything about how the will works and how choice works, I'm sure you can think of a way that Jacen could avoid killing Luke. Anyone? I think that he completely disregards the possibility that he could simply choose not to when the opportunity arises. When it comes to the point of conflict, he could back down. He could surrender. He could change his path moving forward. He could do all manner of things with his own capacity for free choice, the capacity to do as he wishes, as he pleases, to avoid these problems that he sees, to not do the things that he predicts himself doing. He completely forgets that this is an obvious possibility. And instead, he looks into the future and he binds himself to the visions that he sees. He imagines that these are the only possibilities, despite the fact that any other possibility is certainly open to him, or will be open to him as the future gets closer. Because, of course, he can simply choose something different. He disregards this, of course. He's far too enthralled by the idea of fate, by destiny. And so it limits his capacity for choice. Believing in this kind of determinism in fact makes it true. Now, the other example, as I said, is near the end of his tenure as a Sith, of his career, so to speak, and near his death. It leads to his death, and once again, it involves Luke Skywalker. Luke eventually finds out just how obsessed with fate and with visions of the future Jacen is. And he finds out that Jacen has been using his capacity to look into the future to try to plan out what he should do next, and to try and figure out what is happening and what his enemies, primarily the Jedi, are plotting, what they're trying to do, what their plans are to undermine him. And of course, Luke's plan is to have Jaina, Jacen's twin sister, ultimately be the one to defeat him. Both because he, ironically perhaps, prophesied her as the sword of the Jedi sometime earlier, but also because Luke knew, that killing Jacen could not be done fully in the light. That Luke would always have the kind of nagging darkness of having struck down the man who'd struck down his wife. And that ultimately it would be almost impossible to avoid the motivation of revenge. Now that might be a topic for another video. But the point is that what Luke wound up doing to hide the fact that he was ultimately planning to send Jaina to kill Jacen, to finish him off. What Luke began to do was to meditate upon confronting Jacen, to try to place into the Force, and therefore into Jacen's visions, conflict between Jacen and Luke. And so whenever Jacen was peering into the future to see what the Force had in store for him in the future, all he ever saw was a conflict with Luke Skywalker, and so he was obsessed with Luke. And he completely overlooked the possibility that Jaina was the real threat. And ultimately, of course, to spoil the ending, she does kill him. And he did not see it coming. He was so obsessed with fate, with destiny, with peering into the future and using that to shape his present decisions, that he was unable to see what the future would actually hold. Because he had embraced these choices that he saw as being completely determined, rather than moving through life of his own accord. And now, like I said, just like all of the other issues, we can fall into this as well. We can start trying desperately to predict the future. And while we don't have the power of the Force to help us do that, we certainly have the capacity to predict things, to figure out how things might go. But if we become obsessed with that, of trying desperately to figure out what is the best thing to do that will lead to this or that course of action all along the line, where does this chain of dominoes lead and which is the last one that will fall, and if we are so obsessed with those sorts of things, we can completely forget about the moment. And further, we can dive too far into a kind of consequentialist ethic as well. We can start to forget the importance of the decisions that we're having in the moment for the moment. Now, another potential problem here is we might, with a bit of a more mystical bent, we might start to obsess over what our destiny is. What am I meant to do in a Christian context? What is my vocation? What is my calling? What is God calling me to do? And if we obsess about that, we run the risk of not actually doing it. Again, in a Catholic vocational context, if you are discerning whether your vocation is, say, to the priesthood or to married life, and you are discerning and discerning and discerning and praying and praying and praying, and perhaps I think I might be better suited to one or the other, or perhaps God is calling me towards one or the other, but I can't be sure. I need to pray on it some more. Before you know it, most of life has passed you by. And if you do wind up finding your vocation, you'll have found it very late in life, and you will have precious little time to actually pursue the vocation. Again, this is an easy trap to fall into, both a spiritual trap and simply an ethical one, in terms of our actions and how we plan them out. And so, in addition to sum up, in addition to the obvious cases of things that we should avoid imitating a Sith like Darth Caedus, the murder and conquest and all of the terrible, nasty things as he did on the dark side, I think that we can look to how he fell. We can look to what led to his descent to the dark side, and we can start shaping our own lives and learning from the mistakes that we read about. After all, I think that is one of the key uses of fiction anyway, is to try to learn from it, to learn moral lessons, to avoid the mistakes that we see, and to pursue the virtues that we see represented. So, I hope this was edifying, I hope this was interesting, and I hope that I'm also inspiring you perhaps to dive into the Star Wars Expanded Universe if you haven't already. So, until the next one, I've been Professor McCoy. I'll see you then.